Ever wonder why 2 of the 3 video game consoles are Japanese? Ever wonder why when you hear about so many consoles that your parents played back in the day, but you don't hear about them anymore? When I go to my local game shop, I see all the Atari, Coleco, Mattel, and more games for Nintendo at a single fixed price, about $5. Some of those games are very obscure yet also so common that there are several copies next to each other. So enough beating around the bush. What happened here? If you have a collector friend or are you yourself in the retro game scene, then you have heard of a little thing called the video game crash of 1983. So some backstory. The biggest myth of the game crash is that it was caused by E.T. on the Atari 2600. Yes, a movie tie-in game caused the crash, according to this rumor. Playing today or just watching the playthrough on YouTube because I don't have work in Atari, you can tell that it is just a typical Rush tie-in game. Yes, bargain bin, but something that can nearly destroy an industry? No, really E.T. was just a straw that broke the camel's back. What happened was that the market was absolutely flooded with shovelware. Think more like Steam right now. Atari actually lost publishing control because of how easy it was to develop for the Atari. Most famously was Activision, which split off from Atari after the developers were stiffed in the credits department. That is to say, they didn't get credit. Activision was the first third-party developer, and they made games for the Atari because consoles at the time, well at least Atari, were made with very basic parts. Any competent computer technician could build one in their garage back then. As a result, Atari couldn't patent the 2600. Other consoles even had attachment to play Atari games, and yes, they got away with it. Even Atari made rushed-out shovelware. Most notably is the port of Pac-Man, which the version that was released on the 2600 was a prototype. On top of that, there were 12 million copies of Pac-Man, where there were only 10 million Ataris in the wild. So when E.T. came out, it was just the cherry on top. People saw home consoles as inferior for gaming and opted in favor of early computers and the arcade scene. The arcade scene is an important player that will come up again later. For now though, all of these shoddy ports, rushed games have caught up to the market and people left in droves. The value of games have plummeted and were barely worth the plastic shell, which is why the store here sells them for $5 per pop to this day. They don't even test them, because they still consider it a loss, nearly 40 years later. Several players in the home market scene won't make it to the end of the decade. The only survivor will be Atari, for now. So here we have a home console market so damaged that companies weren't sure it would ever recover. Enter Nintendo, an arcade star known for Donkey Kong and Mario Brothers. They still had goodwill with the public. They looked at the situation that happened with Atari and the others and took great cautions as a way to have publishing control on their own console. The NES lockout chip was created for just this purpose. It acted like, well, a lock that could only be unlocked with a code that only Nintendo could write. For now, they accomplished this by building the cartridge themselves. There was also a push to try and make the games as close to arcade quality as possible. It wasn't perfect, of course, because this was the early 80s, and arcade machines were still far more advanced than anything at home. There was another problem though. The very idea of video games was so tainted in the eyes of the public that Nintendo decided to redesign the Famicom so that it won't look like a game console. The first design was dismissed as a game console. Nintendo knew they had to redesign again or shut down the project. One solution was to market it as a toy. They did this with Rob the Robot, an accessory for a video games console. It was a very complicated button presser. So the next thing they did was design the console to look more like a VHS player, which is why you put the cartridges in through the side and press it down. Everything in place, the Nintendo Entertainment System was released and was sold off of Rob. With the NES in hand, Nintendo made a name for themselves in the home console market. They got a great amount of control too, being the only quality console on the market at the time. For a while, the only competition was the PC market and a little bit of arcades, but Nintendo had the advantage of being able to just pick up and play their games, as opposed to learning how to code to start up King's Quest. Nintendo would face some stiff resistance because of their immense control due to how they restricted game releases. See Tengen for more on that. Today, Nintendo still has a spot in the big leagues. Atari, however, only exists today in name. They stopped making consoles after the Jaguar flopped. That was 2 consoles in a row that flopped for them. Nintendo did have a competitor in Japan who decided that they shouldn't have this much control of the Western market, so Sega later released their Master System. American game companies only really make games now. Microsoft was the first American console manufacturer since Atari, or at least the only one that really counts. There are also some genuine good consoles and games that came out during the crash and have performed poorly as a result. A lot of them have received cold appeals since then, but nonetheless, as I sign off today, let's remember those who didn't make it through.